On a chilly November morning in 1396, the grand halls of St. Paul's Cathedral in London glowed with the flicker of hundreds of candles. Their soft light shimmered against the tall Gothic windows, casting shadows that danced on the stone walls. As the sound of the cathedral organ filled the air with solemn notes, a royal procession slowly moved down the central aisle. This wasn't just any ceremony. It was a wedding. But unlike others, the bride wasn't a young woman ready for marriage. She was a 6-year-old child. Isabel of France, a tiny princess with a heavy gold crown wobbling on her head, was being led to the altar. There, waiting for her, stood her groom King Richard II of England, a grown man nearly 30 years old. Dressed in flowing golden silks that trailed behind her, Isabel could barely carry herself, much less understand the gravity of what was happening. Yet, in just a few moments, she would be crowned Queen of England. This marriage wasn't about love. It was about power, politics, and the hope of peace between two enemy nations. To truly understand how this young girl became the centerpiece of such a monumental and heartbreaking event, we must look back at the world she was born into. Isabel was born on November 9, 1389, at the Louvre Palace in Paris. Her father was King Charles VI of France, and her mother was Queen Isabel of Bavaria. From the moment of her birth, her life was marked by darkness and turmoil. Her father, known throughout Europe as Charles the Mad, had begun suffering from mental illness at the age of 24. His condition was unpredictable and terrifying. Sometimes he failed to recognize his own wife and children. Other times he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He would run screaming through the palace, convinced invisible enemies were chasing him. Because of his illness, France was often left without strong leadership, and various noble factions fought bitterly to control the country in his absence. Her mother, Queen Isabel, had a reputation that was no less controversial. She was seen by many as power-hungry and morally questionable. Rather than focusing on her children's well-being, she seemed more interested in using her husband's illness to gain influence and wealth. Chroniclers from that time often painted her as a cold and calculating woman who took lovers openly and saw her children, especially her daughters, as bargaining chips. In her mind, Isabel wasn't a child to be cherished, but a valuable pawn to be traded in the dangerous game of European politics. Growing up in this environment, Isabel was surrounded by court plots, rivalries, and the constant threat of war. France was deep in the 100 Years' War against England, a conflict that had already stretched across generations. At the same time, civil strife between rival factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, tore the kingdom apart. The shadow of her father's madness hung over everything. For a sensitive and impressionable little girl, witnessing his terrifying breakdowns and her mother's cold indifference must have left deep emotional scars. By 1396, when Isabel was only 6 years old, France saw a chance to escape at least some of its troubles. Across the Channel, King Richard II of England was in a difficult position. He had recently lost his beloved wife, Anne of Bohemia, and was facing growing unrest at home. In hopes of stabilizing his rule, he reached out to France to discuss a peace agreement. The French, desperate to end the financial and human cost of the war, saw this as an ideal opportunity. Led by the Duke of Berry, they proposed something bold: a royal marriage between the English king and little Isabel. They offered a dowry of £800,000, an astronomical summand, a 28-year truce. It was an enormous gamble, but to the French crown, peace was worth the price of a child. The talks between the two kingdoms dragged on for months. Ambassadors went back and forth, not treating Isabel like a little girl, but like a product in a business deal. Her age was a major point of debate. Even by medieval standards, 6 was considered shockingly young for a bride. Some English nobles recommended waiting until she was 12, the age typically seen as acceptable for marriage. But King Richard was in no mood to delay. With rebellion brewing at home and his finances in ruins, he needed the political and financial benefits of marriage immediately. In the end, desperation won out over morality. The marriage was agreed upon, and Isabel was handed over like a gift, her fate sealed by men who saw her as a means to an end. The farewell scene at the Louvre was designed to impress the English. King Charles VI, lucid for a rare moment, wept as he gave his daughter a blessing. Queen Isabel, however, treated the occasion like the closing of a successful deal. For Isabel, It was all confusing. She thought the journey might be short and fun, just an adventure. She packed a few of her favorite things, some dolls, a few toys, and her small pet dog. Her entourage included noblemen, ladies-in-waiting, guards, and servants. It was a royal caravan fit for a princess, but none of it could soothe the fear she would come to feel. The journey from Calais to London was long and full of ceremonial stops. Each city along the way tried to outdo the last in welcoming the future queen. But Isabel, still just a child, found the process exhausting and frightening. She often cried and asked when she could return home. In London, King Richard had arranged an extravagant wedding meant to dazzle both nations. St. Paul's Cathedral was decorated with a mixture of French and English symbols, representing the long-hoped-for unity. Thousands of imported candles lit up the interior. Choirs sang in both French and Latin. The ceremony wasn't just for show, it was a declaration of peace. Despite his political motivations, Richard was said to be uncomfortable. At 29, he had been deeply in love with his late wife. Marrying a child seemed unnatural, but duty and desperation left him with no choice. Isabel said nothing during the ceremony. The Archbishop of Canterbury had to kneel to place the wedding ring on her tiny hand. Surrounded by strangers in a foreign land, she looked around helplessly for familiar faces. When she was proclaimed Queen of England, she didn't smile or rejoice. She looked frightened, lost in a world far beyond her years. At first, life in England was manageable for Isabel. Because of her young age, King Richard treated her more like a daughter than a spouse. He gave her private tutors who spoke French, allowed her to keep many of her cultural traditions, and made sure she lived with the dignity her title demanded. She had her own chambers at Westminster, a country manor, and a staff who cared for her. But that fragile peace soon shattered. In 1399, just 3 years after the wedding, Richard was overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became King Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned and eventually killed. Isabel, now just 10 years old, found herself a widow without having ever lived as a true wife. Her future became uncertain. She had no children to secure her place at court, and the huge dowry paid for her marriage had already been spent. Henry IV wasn't keen to return her to France, since that would also mean returning a fortune England no longer had. Instead, he kept her confined at Havering Castle, treating her well, but using her as a pawn in future negotiations. Isabel's letters from this time reveal her growing pain and maturity. In one tearful message to her father, she wrote, "I write to you in tears. I am kept here like a prisoner, far from all I love." Her words eventually reached the heart of Charles VI, who insisted on her return. After years of diplomatic haggling, Isabel was finally sent back to France in 1401. She was 12 years old, no longer the innocent child who had left Paris, but a young girl aged far beyond her years. Unfortunately, returning home didn't bring the joy she hoped for. France was still in chaos, and her family saw her more as a burden than a returning daughter. Her story should have ended there, but life had more sorrow in store. In 1405, at just 16, her mother arranged a second marriage, this time to Charles, Duke of But. This union was different. Charles was kind, poetic, and genuinely in love with Isabel. For the first time, she experienced affection not based on politics, but on real emotion. Together, they shared a brief period of happiness, filled with poetry, music, and love. But tragedy struck again. In 1407, just 2 years after their wedding, Charles was captured during a battle and taken to England as a prisoner, where he would remain for the next 25 years. Isabel was once more left alone, effectively a widow again. She had finally found love, only to lose it almost immediately. Over the next few years, Isabel lived quietly, away from the spotlight of politics. She focused on charity work and supported the arts. Her years as England's child queen had taught her much about diplomacy and the cruelty of royal life. She used that wisdom to quietly guide younger members of the royal family. In 1409, she gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Joan. Although Joan gave her a new sense of purpose, Isabel knew too well that her daughter might also be used one day in the same heartless political games. Later that year, Isabel died from complications following childbirth. She was only 20. Her death passed with little fanfare, a stark contrast to the lavish ceremonies that had marked her early years. Her life had been shaped entirely by the decisions of others, married off, held prisoner, sent away, and used for diplomacy. Her own desires and dreams had never truly mattered to those in power. Isabel of France's life stands as a haunting reminder of the cost of royal politics, especially for girls born into nobility. Her story forces us to confront a bitter truth, that in many periods of history, children were used as bargaining tools, traded like possessions, their humanity ignored. More than 600 years later, Isabel's story still resonates. It speaks to the pain of child marriage, the silencing of women, and the unimaginable cost of political ambition. The girl who was made queen at 6 never got to choose her fate. She sacrificed her happiness and ultimately her life for a peace that would not last.